The 4% rule is a lie. Many of you have used the 4% rule as a guidepost to determine whether or not you are going to be able to comfortably live your lifestyle in retirement and have 100% success. Now, I'll explain to you what the 4% rule is, and it's a guideline that's been around for many years. And essentially what it says is that if you take your principal amount of total investments and liquidity and you multiply it by 4%, and that's able to replace or exceed what your lifestyle income wants to be in retirement, that you will have 100% success and that you will never have to dip into your principal. Well, here's why that's not true. So there's 4 distinct reasons why there is a problem with that thought process. Number 1 is inflation. So as many of you have seen over the last few years, inflation swings rapidly. We can look back just a few years ago when it was right around 2-3%, to most recently where it almost touched double digits. And so as you look at inflation each year, your value of your portfolio in terms of the value of your actual spending power could increase or decrease depending upon the current environment. So again, that 4% static rule, yes, it may be a consistent return that you will get in terms of income, but don't forget the fact that your purchasing power may be affected by that. So inflation is a big reason that is going to be a challenge for you when trying to find this guideline. The second component is going to be healthcare. For many of you that have been employed, you've been getting a steady W-2 income, chances are your employer has provided a portion of your healthcare coverage and covered some of your premium. When you leave your employer and you move into retirement, you will now be responsible for your own healthcare coverage. Now, there are certain programs that will be made available to you like Medicare, but keep in mind in most Medicare plans, you're only going to get a partial coverage. The rest of it is you're going to have to pay for out of pocket. So that's a huge increase in your expenses that you will receive right away when you move into that retirement cycle. In addition to that, medical costs are probably the largest expense that will continue to increase with inflation. The average cost of most couples over a period of time can be upwards of the 6-figure mark in terms of what you will have to pay in terms of medical costs. And so that's a huge impact to your, again, purchasing power. So you'll still see that 4% withdrawal coming out every single year, but the purchasing power may not be as high as you think. And on top of that, your expenses are going to increase during that time period. The third component, which a lot of people don't think about, is long-term care. And so once again, while you may be receiving that steady income on a regular basis, at some point you may need some type of assisted living. In fact, upwards of about 70% of people need some form of long-term care by the time they're age 70. Now, in a lot of cases, that may just be very minor care where you have some type of assisted living, all the way up into a long-term care facility. And the pricing and the expenses on that can widely range. Everything from a few $1,000s a month all the way up to $70,000, $80,000 a year. And so once again, as you get to that point, you could be significantly tapping into that principal and make the probability of your success not as great as you would like. The last component is what we call the sequence of returns. So keep in mind, in most cases, you are not getting a rate of return that is going to necessarily be consistent with that 4% rule. There are going to be some years where you're going to get significantly higher than that 4%, and in some cases, the market may not do so well, and you may get a less rate of return on your portfolio. So again, using an example, let's say the market is down 5%. Make it very simple. If you're taking that 4% distribution from your principal, you've got a delta of right around 9%. So in that case, your principal will see a decrease if you want to continue to take that level of income out for that year. Now, vice versa, if your portfolio does increase because the market does well, not only will it replenish the distribution amount, but it actually could increase the portfolio that you have. Keep in mind, for most of you that do invest in the market, it is an up and down roller coaster ride that you will go on. Now, for those of you that want to be conservative, and many of you do, where you want to invest in more fixed income, could be CDs, it could be bonds, yes, you will have a lot less volatility, but again, you cannot forget to account for inflation, which in a lot of cases, if you are investing in fixed income, does have an impact on that return. So the sequence of returns does have an impact on your overall financial plan, and it's something that, again, that 4% rule doesn't necessarily take into account those types of swings in your portfolio value. The other items that you want to consider are areas in terms of spending habits. So there's what's called the SMILE spending habit. And what that looks like is typically when you first retire, you're going to do all the fun things that you've been wanting to do while you were working, but that you couldn't do. So things like traveling, starting new hobbies, maybe purchasing fun things that you didn't have a chance to do. So those first few years, your expenses are typically a lot higher. And then once you go through that phase, your expenses drop and you kind of find a good, comfortable lifestyle that you want to live. And that happens over a period of years. Then you get to that point where you start to see those medical costs increase. And on top of the medical costs, you are starting to look at areas such as long-term care. And so that's where your expenses will go back up. And that's why they call that the SMILE spending curve that you will typically see in retirement. So as I recap the 4% rule, there's 4 different areas that you want to make sure that you don't forget about. Number 1 is inflation, which a lot of people I talk to, that's an area that is a blind spot and they don't take that in consideration. The second component of that is going to be healthcare costs and making sure that you have that accounted for in your plan. Along with that would be number 3, which is long-term care, making sure that you do understand that there's a very, very strong possibility that that is going to be a larger expense as you age. And then the 4th one is the sequence of returns. Now, there's a couple different strategies that you can take as it relates to the distributions that are going to make this a little bit of an easier way to manage this 4% rule. But I'm going to take one step back real quick. And the first thing you have to determine is what type of lifestyle that you want to have, because that should match up to your spending habits. So for example, if maybe you don't have kids, maybe leaving a legacy or leaving money after you pass is not as important, there's no reason why you shouldn't increase your spending habits beyond that 4%, because ideally maybe you want to spend the remaining amount of your principal that you've worked so hard to attain down to a very minimal amount. So that's one way you can plan, is you can just look at a way to basically spend that down to 0. On the flip side, if you do have children, if you do have a legacy, maybe you're charitably inclined and you do want to leave a good amount of money once you pass, then your spending habits will change for that as well. You're typically going to live more of a comfortable lifestyle, not get anything too extravagant, and you'll want to have some type of dollar amount in mind that you want to leave. Once again, keep in mind that the 4% rule doesn't guarantee that that principal amount will necessarily be there. So if you have a different dollar amount in mind, you have to make sure that you account for that in your actual financial plan and your cash flow analysis. So let's move to different ways that you can distribute the funds that are going to accomplish one of those 2 goals and maybe somewhere in between. So you have the standard 4% rule, which is essentially you're taking 4% of your principal amount every single year, and it's consistent across the board. In theory, that should leave that principal amount at the end of your lifespan. Now, granted, given the factors that we just talked about, that's not going to necessarily be the case. It could be more, it could be less. So that's the 4% rule. The second approach could be is you take the actual returns that you get off of your portfolio. So in some years, you're able to take more if your portfolio goes up significantly higher. And in some cases, if it goes lower, either maybe you're not taking a distribution at all or you're taking a lower distribution. Another approach that you can take is just to flat out put a fixed amount in there. So you could take a fixed amount and say over a period of time, you're going to take X amount of dollars. This is most likely going to be appropriate for those that are going to want to spend down their assets over their lifetime. Another way that you can do this to account for inflation, which is one of the factors that I mentioned at the very beginning, is adding the current inflation to your distribution rate. So say, for example, that inflation was 3% this year and your distribution was 4%. Instead of just taking the 4%, you may have to account for inflation and actually take 7% out of your portfolio. So that's another approach that you can take. Again, touching on each of the factors when it comes to long-term care, maybe that's something that you pull out in addition to the 4% or whatever your distribution rate is to account for that specific expense. So these are all different spending strategies that you can take that are very much have to be aligned to your goals in terms of what you want to accomplish. So as you get ready to prepare for retirement, you're in that red zone, call it that 2 to 3 years out. These are important discussions that you want to have with your financial planning team and your trusted advisor team. If you haven't already, you want to run some type of cash flow analysis. And I'll point out one thing is that for many of you that have done this cash flow analysis, you've probably heard of the term Monte Carlo simulation. And what that means, and you may have seen this already, is it's a graph that's going to show thousands of different scenarios that could happen based on the market and how your portfolio does, and overall how you would perform in terms of the cash flow you need, your principal amount, and your ultimate long-term goals, and it'll give you a percentage of success rate. And it's got some type of guideline. Every firm is a little bit different in terms of what they define as success, but a general rule of thumb is if you're at an 80% or higher, you are in what's called the confidence zone, meaning you could feel pretty confident that no matter what happens, you're going to be in a good situation. But I'll draw back again the importance of the sequence of returns, because again, that's something that's very important. You don't want to just look at the total return over that period of time. You want to look at the cycles and what happens during each year where you are taking a distribution. So if you have not done that cash flow analysis, do that now. Reach out to your financial planner, your advisor, sit down, go through that exercise. The more information you can provide, the better. So don't just do a basic general, forecast where you're just putting a general income, general lifestyle. Actually break it down into your individual expenses, the years that you plan to spend more than others, what your goals are in terms of at your end of life plan, how much you want to leave, if you want to leave anything at all. But make sure you go through that process with your financial planner. Now, if you are in that retirement scenario, this isn't a set it and forget it plan. Every year you should be reviewing this with your financial planner, financial advisor to make sure that you are still on track and that your personal goals have not changed over that time period. There are many life changes that could happen, such as marriages within your families, divorce, people that have passed away that maybe you've allocated certain dollars to. So you want to make sure that you are sitting down at least on an annual basis to review this plan, as it is a dynamic plan. It's not a static one. So if you've not done this already, you can reach out to us. We actually have what's called a Freedom Roadmap. Now, this is primarily specific to business owners, where we'll take a look at an informal value of your business, plug that into your cash flow analysis plan, and make sure that you have a plan in place post-transition out of the business. But we also offer this to individuals that are not necessarily business owners. We'll do a cash flow analysis for you as well, and we'll do a deep dive into what's important to you and what you're going to need to do within those next few years prior to actually retiring. So reach out to us. You can click on the link below, get your free 30-minute strategy session. And if there's any questions, drop them in the comments. We'll reach back out to you and answer them. And again, don't forget, the 4% rule is not a guideline that works for everybody. Make sure that you take the time to go through your specific situation and come up with a distribution strategy that's going to be right for you.